It's a special treat to welcome Jillian Melchior back to the Freedom Conference. Jillian was the second recipient of our Tony Blankley Fellowship for Public Policy and American Exceptionalism in 2015, and it's been amazing to watch the growth in her career and the important work she has done over the past 7 years. Jillian is an editorial page writer for the Wall Street Journal. Early in her career, she lived in China, where she was a Bartley Fellow at the Wall Street Journal Asia. She's written extensively on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, and she has made multiple trips to Ukraine since the Russian invasion began earlier this year, reporting on the devastating effects of the war on the Ukrainian people. Jillian is a graduate of Hillsdale College and a native of Cheyenne, Wyoming. She and her husband live in New York City, and we are delighted that both of them are with us this weekend. Please remember to submit your questions for Jillian using the QR code provided. And now, please stand if you are able for the playing of the Ukrainian national anthem in honor of this week's 31st anniversary of Ukraine's Independence Day.
Ні слава, ні воля, ще нам, браття українці, усміхнеться доля. Згинуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці. Запануєм ми, браття, у своїй сторонці, душу й тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що
Welcome, Jillian Melchior.
Thank you. Thank you. Make sure I'm on. Can you hear me all right? Great. So to begin this speech, let me take you to a city called Mariupol. This is a city in eastern Ukraine. It's perched on the Sea of Azov, and in 2021, it was home to about 500,000 people. This city is a famous place for blue-collar work, for its steel factory, for its ports. And just last year, one of the residents told me that it was beginning to get really cool. I want to show you what it looked like back then.
Settled there.
Since
then, Mariupol has played an
Is it possible to cut the sound on that? Let's see.
settled there.
Well, anyway, it was a really beautiful city, and I know people who are from it. I had actually asked some of them to talk to us about it, but they couldn't do it this time because the loss is too raw. So back in 2021, when the city was still standing, it was famed also for its friendly feelings toward Russia. The Kiev-based Center for Social Indicators polled the city in 2020, and they found out that fewer than 1% of the residents spoke Ukrainian at home. Most of them spoke Russian. More than 80% of them agreed with the statement that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and more than a third said that they believed that Ukraine must be in the Russian sphere of influence and the Western countries should respect that. Now, I'm bringing this up because, as a source told me, this was the Ukrainian city that was the most friendly to Russia, that liked Russia the most. And next, I'm going to show you what the Russians did to this city. On February 24th, Russia launched its full invasion of Ukraine, and seizing Mariupol was a top priority. Vladimir Putin had claimed that this special military operation was targeted at denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine and protecting the Russian-speaking communities. And yet this is what Russia wrought on Russian-speaking Mariupol. By March 19th, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reported that 90% of the city was destroyed. That is 1 in 9 homes, 1 in 9 businesses. The Russians carried out an airstrike on March 16th, and they hit a theater where civilians were taking shelter. More than 600 people died there, including children and pregnant women. They were shredded by shrapnel, dismembered by explosions, or crushed to death there. And other strikes on Mariupol targeted a maternity hospital. We still don't know the total number dead there, but the slaughter is easily in the tens of thousands. Now, before we go to the next slide, I am going to give you what I think is probably the first trigger warning in Steamboat Institute history. And I debated really long and hard whether or not to show you this image. It is extremely violent. And so I'm giving you the chance to look away because I know that there are some things that you can't unsee. But I'd encourage you, if you think you can handle it, to bear witness, to let yourself be shocked and horrified. This image was taken in Mariupol in March, and it will show you what Russia has done to Ukrainian civilians that it claims to be protecting. I'm going to put it up on the screen for about 5 seconds, and then I'm going to let you know when it's down in case you avert your eyes. Are you ready? Okay. This is the reality in Ukraine every single day for the last 6 months. We're nearing 6 months of war, and this is what civilians are enduring. I'm going to take it down. So, in May, I received a text message from Mariupol, the city under assault. And it came from Bogdan Krotovich, a 29-year-old soldier who was fighting in Mariupol. You'll see him here, looking weary but peaceful. Do you see that dog who's beside him? He told me that shortly after this photo was taken, it was killed by a Russian landmine. And then he told me about the other things that he was seeing. Kids and women are dying, he said. They're being killed and raped. It is hell in Mariupol, and it is difficult for me to talk about, he told me. Mr. Krotovich messaged me from the Azovstal steel plant. This spring, that bunker became the last refuge for some 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers who remained to defend Mariupol from the Russian onslaught. It also sheltered more than 300 civilians, including women, children, and even a 4-month-old baby. This sprawling steel complex was built to handle molten metal. It offered significant protection against tank rounds, artillery, and aerial bombs. But the Ukrainians were trapped inside, and none of their choices were good. Mr. Krotovich told me about the dire conditions in these damp underground bunkers. Some of the people there had amputated limbs, torn out muscles, and serious burns. They were literally rotting away, is how he put it. He wouldn't tell me how much ammunition or food remained, but it was quickly dwindling. Painkillers, he said, were already in critically small amounts. People were dying in agony. Russians were pounding the steel plant, and no one knew how long the structure or the soldiers could hold out. They were surrounded, so escape was impossible. Russia and Ukraine could try to negotiate some sort of escape, but Moscow can't be trusted, and the soldiers in the Azovstal steel plant knew that. Heavy on their mind was an incident back in 2014 where the Russians ambushed Ukrainian soldiers who had laid down their arms in promise of safe passage, and they were all killed. Russia reserves a special hatred for Mr. Krotovich's unit, the Azov Regiment. This Azov Regiment is known for its courage, but also its controversy. Early in 2014, the US media reported that some members of the Azov Regiment espoused neo-Nazi ideology, so that's something I wanted to ask Mr. Krotovich about. Here's what he told me. Like in other units, including military units of the US Army, there are some individuals who hold Nazi views. But he said that labeling the entire regiment neo-Nazi is like calling all Americans racist because the KKK exists in the United States. We in the conservative movement in America know that anytime you get a bunch of young guys, there are going to be a couple of knuckleheads in the group. But Mr. Krotovich was really insistent on communicating that the Azov Regiment and the Ukrainian military have done a lot to purge radicals within their ranks. In fact, he told me that the Azov Regiment had dishonorably discharged them without the right to wear a uniform or chevron. Nonetheless, the Kremlin has taken up this claim to portray the Azov Regiment and all of Ukraine as a safe harbor for neo-Nazis. Not all of the soldiers in Mariupol or in Azovstal belonged to the Azov regiment. Ukrainian Marines, first responders, other military units also served there. But because of the Azov regiment's presence, the soldiers in Mariupol knew that if they were captured, they could expect no mercy. And they stood their ground and stayed there anyway. So when I was beginning to speak to Mr. Krotovich, he was in a terrible dilemma, and so is his country. History brought both of them to Mariupol this spring, and I am hoping to help you understand how they got here. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, and it suffered terribly under communism. We heard today a little bit about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. If you go there, I think you'll learn about the history and about how Russian rule of Ukraine, Soviet rule of Ukraine, was terrible. Communism, as we know, leads to hunger, and under Stalin, millions of Ukrainians died from 1932 to 1933 in the man-made famine known as the Holodomor. Ukrainians also bore the brunt of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. As you can see on the HBO documentary, or the HBO show, which actually dramatizes this really well, communists lied. They covered up this catastrophe, and Ukrainians perished as a result. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant an opportunity for Ukraine, and Ukrainians saw that post-Soviet Russia had descended into corruption and lacked democracy, and they longed for a different future. They wanted freedom, they wanted rule of law, and they looked to the West, not to the East, for inspiration. Ukraine went so far as to give up its nuclear weapons under the 1994 agreement known as the Budapest Memorandum. In exchange for giving up its nukes, Ukraine got security assurances from the United States, Great Britain, and also Russia. And as we know now, surrendering that deterrent proved a terrible mistake. But before we get to right now and why that was a mistake, let's go to 2013. Ukrainian lawmakers negotiated a political and economic agreement with the European Union, and this agreement became the symbol of the hopes and dreams of Ukraine and its Western-aligned hopes and dreams. But in 2013, the EU deal was vetoed by Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who was in Vladimir Putin's pocket. Ukrainian students went to Kiev's Independence Square, which you can see here, and they wanted to peacefully protest for the future that they envisioned. Yanukovych responded by sending riot police to brutally beat them. This enraged Ukrainian parents, professionals, and residents of Kiev. There's a moment that one of my sources described to me there, and there's the St. Sophia Cathedral up at the top. Maidan Square is kind of at the bottom of a valley. But at St. Sophia, they have these beautiful bells, and the bells had always been rung when the city was under attack. And after these students were beaten by the riot police of their own government, someone went up there and rang the bells. And it was a symbol that their hopes of democracy, the country that they had invested a lot in, was under assault from within. And so quickly after that, you saw a lot of Ukrainians coming to Maidan Square. They wanted to stand in solidarity with these students and speak out for the future that they saw for their country. And Yanukovych, unfortunately, responded with more violence. Riot police used tear gas and water cannons. Ukrainians still stood their ground. The Yanukovych regime freed violent criminals from the prisons and unleashed them on the peaceful protesters. The Ukrainians continued to stand their ground. And then riot police fired their guns into the crowd, and more than 100 protesters died. This is when I first learned how tough Ukrainians were and how serious they were about their free future. The riot police wore the same uniforms. They represented the indistinguishable collective. But the protesters showed up in helmets lovingly painted by local artists, and this was meant to be a show of individual free expression. The riot police fired guns, and the Ukrainians stood their ground and reluctantly defended themselves. I will never forget interviewing Sofia Brovchenko, she's the girl on the right here, 19 years old at the time. She told me that she believed that violent self-defense became justified when the police used deadly force against peaceful protesters. She made Molotov cocktails. She told me that she was terrified of being arrested, but she was equally afraid because she was filling up bottles with petrol. And in Maidan, I visited shortly after the protests had concluded, but one of the lingering sensory memories for me is there were these big bonfires that people had because it was the dead of winter and you had water cannons and you had the extreme cold. She would venture near them for warmth, and she was afraid that she would immolate. But she felt that the second that the police started firing a gun into the crowd of protesters, that she had no recourse. Other Ukrainians found similar ways to make themselves useful. Some bought food, blankets, and delivered them to the protesters. Others provided first aid services. Ukrainians worried that injured protesters would be arrested at the hospital, and so this blew me away. They crowdsourced for expensive medical equipment, and they set up clandestine clinics to treat protesters. As Alexis de Tocqueville highlighted in the book Democracy in America, a strong civil society is the foundation of a functioning democracy. And in the streets of Kiev in 2013 and 2014, Ukrainians learned to self-govern. They refer to these protests today as the Revolution of Dignity, and they succeeded. On February 22nd, Yanukovych fled Ukraine for Russia, and the Ukrainians soon learned the scale of his corruption and his poor taste. The next slide I'm going to show you is from my visit to Medjugorje. That was his estate outside of Kiev. And I think this is illustrative of sort of the culture of corruption that Russian influence had on Ukraine at that time. If you went out there, it's about 45 minutes probably of a drive, but when Yanukovych would go out there, he would demand that an entire lane of traffic be shut down just for him. And so Ukrainians would be waiting in rush hour traffic because Yanukovych wanted to go to his estate. If you look at it, which I'll show you in a second, it's on the left there, and it also shows, I think, Russian poor taste. It was a mess of different architectural styles. You had like sort of a log cabin thing with a Roman thing with a Baroque thing. It was bizarre. But I guess that's what you do when you have too much money and too little education. By the way, he also had a golden toilet. And I think a little bit more sadly, he had a menagerie of exotic animals, some of them very rare, that he would use to feed and impress other oligarchs. And all of this was from the pockets of the Ukrainian people who he was exploiting. And of course, adding insult to injury, on the property there was a dacha for Vladimir Putin on the premises, and that's actually his bedroom. So the Ukrainians humiliated Putin when they rejected Russia in favor of Europe in late 2013 and early 2014. And Putin wasted no time in getting his revenge. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and fomented an armed separatist movement in the eastern Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk. The war began in 2014, but it took until 2022 for Russia to mount its full invasion. And the slide that I'm showing you right now is from when I was interviewing Crimean refugees in 2014. They had lost everything. They'd lost their homes. They lost their freedom of religion. If they had stayed in Crimea, a lot of them were separated from their families. And I thought it was really illustrative that in their refugee camp, they didn't have a lot, but they had a dartboard with Putin's face on it. Mr. Krotovich, the soldier that I told you about in Mariupol, was from Crimea. I'm a man, he told me. My country has been attacked by the Russian Federation, and for me, that's more than enough to go and fulfill my duty and defend my motherland, although it had never been my plan to join the military. He wasn't the only Ukrainian to rise to the occasion. Ukrainians felt empowered and responsible for the future of their country after Maidan, after the Revolution of Dignity. They donated and crowdsourced military and medical equipment. Volunteers drove those kits to the front line and delivered them to soldiers. This was spontaneous. This was Ukraine building a society that is horizontal, where every person feels responsible for doing what they can for a democratic cause. And then meanwhile, back in Kiev, former protesters focused on strengthening democratic institutions, improving transparency, and rooting out corruption. That task is not complete, but I think if you look at the progress that Ukraine has made over the past 8 years in strengthening those democratic institutions, it is remarkable, and it is another expression of how badly they want what the West has to offer. In January of this year, weeks before the full invasion, I watched as ordinary citizens prepared to fight for their nation if necessary. Go back in a second. Might be missing a slide. Here we go. So this is actually at a training camp or facility outside of Ukraine, and it was remarkable to see. If you got there early on a Saturday morning, people would be out drinking their coffee, walking their dogs, and teachers, architects, civilians would be spontaneously organizing, getting together to learn military skills in case they needed to use them. So I actually got to see them doing things like learning to handle a weapon, practicing how they would defend buildings and infrastructure, practicing patrol, ambush, how to staunch battlefield wounds, and more. We will never surrender, is what a 46-year-old architect named Dennis told me. We are using every single opportunity to train, and so I think Putin should be afraid of us. On February 24th, 2022, 6 months ago this week, Russia launched its full assault on Ukraine. Explosions jolted Ukrainians from their beds before dawn that morning, as missiles and airstrikes rained down on the capital city of Kiev and on dozens of cities across Ukraine. So I actually asked a friend of mine in Kiev, Andrew Kostenko, to tell you about his experience in the first couple days of the war. And this week, I just want to drive home that in those 6 months, Ukrainian's Ministry of Defense came out with its first estimates of casualty that it has released since the beginning of the war. 9,000 people died. I'm going to play Andrew's video in just a second, and I want you to just absorb the shock of what he went through and the sort of surrealness of it. But what he doesn't actually tell you is that he was ready to fight. He joined the territorial defense, and that thousands of Ukrainian men responded to this shock, this jolt to their country, the violent attack on it, with similar courage.
Hi, my name is Andrei Kostenko. I'm 29. I live in Kiev for whole of my life, like from the kid. So this is the story from the first day of war, of Russian invasion, of 24th February 2021. So yeah, let's start. So me and my girlfriend were awakened by a few huge explosions at around 5 a.m. So we live in the south part of Kiev. So part of me was still not really accepting the reality. It was and felt very, very anxious, and me personally needed at least a few minutes to get through nausea and adrenaline getting through. After the explosions, in a few minutes, the Twitter friends and the news confirmed that there was multiple explosions which can be heard and felt all in the Kiev and around the Kiev area. It felt very surreal, and part of me was still hardly accepting the reality. After that, we decided to fulfill water supplies into anything we had in our kitchen, like pans, empty bottles. We even filled the bath with water. At around 9 a.m., we got out from the apartment to buy some first aid supplies in nearest drugstore. So the queues were already pretty huge, but we got lucky to buy everything we needed, and even some of the strong anti-anxiolytics and antibiotics, which you can only buy by subscription, by medical subscription. But luckily, drugstore shop assistant understood the situation is critical and sold the stuff we planned initially to buy without any problems or questions. So after that, we decided to move to northern part of Kiev, where the rest of my family lives, where like my mother lives, and we decided to make some family meeting there to cheer each other up and plan the next moves and steps. So needless to say that the rocket strikes continued that day every hour or so, at least the ones that could be spotted or heard by us. I think I personally seen at least 2 rockets that day flying over my head, and I don't know, maybe tens of explosions I heard or felt. The way to parents' place was all the way through the town, so from southern part to northern part. So we decided to use the subway as the safest place. Subway was already crowded with families, animals, people. Some people already placed sleeping bags there to use it as a shelter. After getting to the parents' place, I spotted 2 probably Russian armored vehicles out from a balcony, which is on the 2nd floor. So because we live like in the 9th floor multi-apartment building. So the vehicles the drivers looked pretty confused because they stopped in the middle of the road. and they just were waving hands at each other, so trying to get a direction to the city center. After that, they turned around, so and moved to the opposite direction. So they looked very lost in the city. So I called the police, but I couldn't get an answer. After I called the firefighter service and told them the coordinates and exact positions. So there was one APC and Humvee. So a few hours later, the local telegram channels confirmed that the vehicles were captured by our troops and the saboteurs were killed right in my neighborhood. After that accident, at the same day, me and my family decided not to stay in the north part of town and move to the southern part of Kiev, more to the countryside. So it's because we decided it's the safest place to be there. And then we planned to move there, and we initially moved there. But that's another story. So thank you for watching and hearing. Have a nice day.
Yeah, so I'll just fill in a little bit of context about what he's saying. So when he was in northern Kiev, that is the part where Russians were advancing toward the capital. And just to give you a sense of how close they got, I made that drive earlier this year. It's about 13 miles. So if you've flown to New York City, it's the difference between JFK and Times Square. So that's the geography that he was dealing with, is he's seeing Russian tanks in the city. And given that, I got to know Andrew because he's the bartender at my favorite spot in Kiev. And this brave bartender not only makes a mean Manhattan, he, in this chaotic circumstance, decided to volunteer to defend his country. And that's so characteristic of the different Ukrainians that I met. And I think it's even more remarkable that he was seeing these things and responded that way. So this is the part of the story that gets infuriating. The United States could have prevented, almost certainly, the atrocities happening in Ukraine today. The war began in 2014. It took until February 2022 until Vladimir Putin launched his full invasion. And Putin's terrible intentions should have been clear. He has repeatedly claimed that Ukraine is not a real nation. He has repeatedly claimed that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole. And actions speak louder than words. And for 8 years, Russia has waged a war of aggression in eastern Ukraine for Ukrainian territory. And for 8 years, Ukrainians have fought and died for their freedom and for their country. During this entire 8-year period, Ukraine needed weaponry, deadly force in particular. It needed this to defend its land and to deter a broader Russian invasion, and yet for 8 years, the United States slow-walked weapons to Ukraine. The current war is the predictable result. The strength of the Ukrainians surprised the West and surprised Vladimir Putin, and I'm not just talking about men like Andrew who fought. In March, I visited Lviv, Uzhhorod, and Vinohradiv in western Ukraine, and I can truly tell you that the resistance is a whole-of-nation effort. If Putin planned for this invasion to swallow Ukraine into a single nation, into one whole with Russia, he failed miserably. The effect has been a real consolidation of the Ukrainian spirit, a unity in the desire for an independent country that is not Russian, and for freedom and for democracy. So I'll show you some of what I saw when I was out in western Ukraine in the next slide. Shop class students welded together giant hedgehogs. They kind of look like jacks, but they're probably about this high, and they're made out of railroad tracks, and they're made to stop tanks. And then I also saw at the shop class teachers were welding together makeshift bulletproof vests because they didn't have enough for their soldiers going to the front line to have even that basic level of equipment. Refugees, women, and even young children gathered to weave camouflage nets to protect soldiers and military equipment. Right there, you've got a famous cook from Kiev, and he actually opened a free restaurant in Lviv for refugees. And the idea was that not only would he provide them with a hot meal, he'd provide them with a respite and a chance to sit down and have a sense of normalcy. Brave train conductors and stewards drove routes into cities under assault to rescue civilians. And as soon as they had ferried those civilians to safety, they turned back and they did it again. I interviewed some of those guys too. They were telling me about driving to the city of Kharkiv and standing in the train station and an explosion going off where they could literally feel the vibration from it in their feet. And these are young people. I think the train steward that I interviewed couldn't have been older than 25. And he was describing how train conductors, you have to have a day off or two to sleep so that you can drive safely. These stewards were running straight to the front line and back, 36, 48 hours without sleep. And when I talked to Ukrainians who had fled from areas that were under heavy assault, one of their most pressing recollections is how these train stewards were exhausted but so brave, and how they comforted them and let them speak about what they'd seen and experienced and encouraged them. So this Ukrainian resilience and spirit is what I attribute to why Ukrainian soldiers were able to prevent the Russians from taking Kiev. They repelled them from the surrounding areas in northern Kiev, the outskirts. And yet the human cost of this war has been enormous, and it continues to grow. So Ukrainian soldiers liberated the cities of Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel, which are just north of Kiev. That's the 12 to 13 miles that I was talking about. And the first to arrive found streets that were littered with bodies. One woman, Irina Filkina, had dreamed of becoming a makeup artist. And when the teacher saw this photograph of a dead woman with perfectly manicured nails, she said, "I physically felt like my heart started to break." She recognized the manicure. She knew that the Russians had murdered her student. Some bodies lay in the streets with their hands bound. Others showed signs of torture. Others were dumped in mass graves, and the scenes were so horrific that they have traumatized the Ukrainian police officers and prosecutors who are now investigating war crimes. The number of open war crimes investigations now exceeds 16,000 in Ukraine. I visited Bucha and Irpin in June, and I saw bombed out buildings there. Ukrainian authorities had done their best to clear the streets of unexploded ordnance, and yet we still had to stick to the pavement because of the risk of touching something and triggering an explosion. I saw charred vehicles, homes reduced to rubble. If you go right outside of Kiev, there's this really surreal scene where there's cars and you don't know who escaped and who didn't, but the cars certainly didn't. It looks like they're hit with bullets or shrapnel, charred, piled up. And that's, I think, a signal of Ukrainian desperation to escape the Russian aggression. The Kiev School of Economics is trying to tally the war damage. And just this week, they estimated that the damage to homes, buildings, and infrastructure alone had exceeded $113.5 billion. In Irpin, I met a 55-year-old man named Petr Kornuk. I'm going to show you him. He had thankfully escaped Irpin before the Russian occupiers came, but when he returned after they had been repelled, he found that they had destroyed his home. And the Russian occupiers had also destroyed the warehouse where he worked, so he has no job. He was talking about how his wife and his daughter made it to safety in Europe, and his son was with him, but because he lacked a job, if his entire family was reunited, he would struggle to feed the family. He had $1,000 saved up. He ended up spending it on fencing, which I thought was such an unusual choice. And I asked him about it, and he said he was building it by hand, because at least this way, I know no one is crawling around my house. And if I am no longer there, something that I have built with my hands, this fence, will be left after me. And his eyes brimmed with tears as he spoke. And the reality really struck from this conversation that for many Ukrainians, you can liberate occupied territory, but Russians have stolen their home. So just to bring this home to another personal note, the blazer that I'm wearing right now is from the Retroville Shopping Center in Kiev. I bought it in late January. It was January 24th, exactly a month before the Russian invasion. 55 days after I bought this jacket, the Russians bombed that mall. They killed at least 8 people there. On April 8th, a Russian missile hit the train station in Kramatorsk, where civilians were trying to flee, and more than 60 people perished there. In late June, Russian missiles struck a shopping center in Kremenchuk, which is very far from the front line. 1,000 people were shopping inside the mall at that time. Dozens died. And then just this past Wednesday, a missile attack on a train station and residential area killed 22 people. I bring this up because the Geneva Conventions prohibit attacks that deliberately target civilians and civilian facilities. Russia is a signatory, but that hasn't stopped the Kremlin from targeting elementary schools, medical facilities, shopping centers, and other civilian infrastructure. My fear now is that the killing and destruction will continue for a very long time. The West has stepped up its efforts. It's helping to arm Ukraine. Yet earlier this summer, military officials and advisors told me that there remained a huge disparity in both the quantity and the range of weaponry. In June, Russia had an advantage of 10-1, and in some locations, 20-1 is what military officials told me. So here's why that matters. Russia's range advantage means that it can strike anywhere in Ukraine. The city of Vinnytsia is in central Ukraine, yet again, far from the front line. But in July, the Russians carried out a missile strike there, and those killed included Liza Dmitrieva, a 4-year-old girl with Down syndrome. You can see her stroller right here. That same strike blew her mother's leg off. Russia uses these strikes to terrorize and to kill Ukrainians. It hopes to terrify them into submission. And if you go to Kiev, one thing that you will notice is that the air raid sirens wail several times a day. I'm going to play one for you from the app on my phone. This is a really common sound there these days. This sound happens early in the morning. It's common to have it wake you up in the middle of the night. It's something that if you were to listen every single time that you heard that sound, you couldn't have a normal life. Now, every time I heard it, I went to the air raid shelter. That's something that I promised my husband, something that I promised my boss. But a lot of Ukrainians don't go to the air raid shelter anymore, and that's something that just baffled me the first couple times I was there until I started talking to Ukrainians about their decision. And it now reminds me a lot of what I've read about the British during World War II. You can't have a normal life if you live in constant fear of the Russian threats. And so by ignoring the air raid sirens, they are carrying on, clutching to that little bit of normalcy is a way of showing defiance and proving to the Russians that you can break and bomb Ukraine, but you can't break the Ukrainian spirit. At the front line, Russia's weapons advantage means that Russia can relentlessly shell territory. It moves forward kilometer by kilometer, shelling with no regard for civilian lives. And I spoke with an American doctor who volunteered there in July, and he told me that he had seen mangled limbs, ripped bellies, exposed intestines. One patient had endured a blast so severe that it pushed his eyeballs out. The shelling makes it very hard for rescuers to go in and take these civilians where they can get medical treatment. People die as a result of this. These are civilians with military injuries, is what the doctor told me. These are kids and moms and dads. The Kiev-based Center for Defense Strategies estimated this week that more than 374 Ukrainian children have died. More than 723 have been injured. But we know that these figures are low because you can't tally the numbers in occupied cities like Mariupol. Because Ukrainians don't have the range that Russians have. They have to get much, much closer to attack Russian command centers and ammunition reserves. This means that Ukrainian soldiers are at more risk that they will get hit while they're undertaking operations. And it also means less time for them to get to safety after they've fired. Russians have the range to fire at them, and they can also fire behind them and try to cut off their escape route after they've conducted a mission. Russia has the luxury of staying at a safe distance as it targets Ukrainian troops and their supporting infrastructure. Ukrainians' scarce supply of weapons and ammunition means that they have to carefully choose their targets, where the Russians can shell and bomb indiscriminately, and that is exactly what they are doing. Since my last visit in June, the US has stepped up its deliveries of arms and ammunition. High-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, are especially important. Their long range has allowed the Ukrainians to carry out significant strikes against Russian storage facilities and command centers. But as of this week, Ukraine has 16 HIMARS. That's what an official told me. They estimate that they need about 100 to defeat the Russians. The Ukrainians still have far too little weaponry and ammunition, and my fear is that the United States and the West is giving them enough to continue their fight, but not to win a decisive victory and take back their territory. So I'm going to go back to Bogdan Krotovich, the soldier in Mariupol. He felt a similar frustration. He referenced the Budapest Memorandum, where the US gave Ukraine security guarantees in exchange for surrendering its nuclear weapons. Here's what he told me. Otto von Bismarck has said that the treaty with Russia is not worth the paper that it is written on, and there are no doubts about that. But can the United States renege on its promises so easily? I asked him what he wanted my audience to understand, and here's what he told me. Evil does not understand agreements and negotiations. Evil only understands power, and waiting only costs a lot of innocent human victims. On May 20th, Mr. Krotovich quit responding to my text messages. But before he went silent, he told me about the decision that the soldiers in the Azovstal steel plant had made. Ukrainians were able to evacuate civilians from bunkers, but the soldiers remained. The Russians had said that either everyone or no one would have to surrender, and those with serious wounds were rotting away and slowly dying in hospitals. So they decided to surrender, and this decision undoubtedly saved lives. I don't know what's happening to Bogdan Krotovich, and I'm not even sure that he's still alive. His family, his sister Sandra, told me that every day for them is agonizing. It's a state of limbo. And that is the daily reality for the families of some 2,000 soldiers who surrendered there. This is Denis Propenko, 30 years old. He's another one of the Mariupol soldiers. And Bogdan described him to me as the linchpin on which the whole defense of Mariupol and the morale of the soldiers rested. I met with his 27-year-old wife, Katerina, in June. She told me that her husband was a natural leader and that he loved the mountains. The couple loved hiking and fishing together, skiing. They got engaged on a backpacking trip. If you look at her wedding ring, it's got an etching of the mountains inside the band. In another reality, maybe he'd be here with us this weekend enjoying beautiful Beaver Creek, but the reality is, right now, we can't imagine what he's enduring. Someone leaked Katerina's phone number on the internet, and she now receives several menacing phone calls every single day. She won't change her number. She answers every single call in the hope that it is her husband. Those who have survived Russian prisons describe what the Russians do to their prisoners of war. In June, I met with one survivor. He told me about how his captors beat Ukrainians in their custody and tortured them with electric shocks. In June, Ukraine and Russia conducted a prisoner exchange that included some of those gravely wounded soldiers, and they returned with harrowing stories. One of them, Vladislav Karakovno, lost his leg, and he told the media this week that even before he started receiving antibiotics after his amputation, the soldiers were interrogating him. He described how some soldiers had needles inserted in their wounds, endured water torture, or were deprived of adequate medical treatment. Another former prisoner of war, Denis Cheperko, described how Ukrainian prisoners were beaten as the Russians tried to extract false confessions of Russian war crimes. And unfortunately, it gets worse. On July 29th, a massive explosion ripped through the Olenivka prison in Donetsk, where dozens of the Mariupol soldiers are being held. Dozens died, more were seriously wounded, and their families still don't know their fate. The Mariupol soldiers who survived may face Russian kangaroo courts and whatever punishments these show trials met out. Some Russian political leaders have called for the death penalty, and the United States should pay attention to the fate of these prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions also enumerate the rights of prisoners of war. That includes humane treatment, access to medical care, protections against acts of violence, intimidation, insult, public curiosity, and reprisal. And yet Russia's targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure and its treatment of prisoners of war flagrantly violate the Geneva Conventions. Russia has already violated its promises to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum. The West should keep this in mind. If we cannot trust Russia to abide by its existing commitments, why on earth would we trust it to respect any negotiated settlement to this war? Russia has shown its intentions. It wants the entirety of Ukraine. It does not care who it has to kill or what it has to destroy to achieve this goal. The war in Ukraine can only end 3 ways. The only acceptable one is a decisive victory for Ukraine. A negotiated settlement will only give Russia time to regroup and mount a new assault from a stronger position while Ukraine is in a weaker position. If Russia is allowed to maintain any of the territory that it seized by force, it will learn that the world will tolerate aggression, and it will seize territory by force again. A Russian victory in Ukraine may end the war, but it will never lead to peace. So I want to talk a little bit about why the fate of Ukraine matters to the United States. Vladimir Putin said in 2016 that the borders of Russia never end, and his imperial ambitions do not stop in Ukraine. If he succeeds there, he will continue this aggression somewhere else. One question that we should be asking is, if Ukraine loses, what country is next? I'm particularly concerned about Moldova, but it could easily also be Slovakia, Romania, or Poland. All of these are neighbors of Ukraine. All of these are NATO members. Ukrainians are fighting and dying today to stop Russian expansionism, and the United States should arm them to defeat Russia. We should arm them to win so that we don't have to fight this battle ourselves. The fate of Ukraine also matters for the world beyond Europe. If Russia is able to invade and conquer Ukraine, what stops China from invading and conquering Taiwan? And by the way, we need to learn the lesson of Ukraine, and the time to arm Taiwan and deter China is now. We have been able to mitigate some of our earlier mistakes because you have those friendly countries on the periphery of Ukraine, and we can get arms in through land borders. But it will be exceedingly difficult to make up for our mistakes if the invasion is happening on an island. A Ukrainian defeat also means a world where the integrity of borders are not respected. It is the resumption of a world where might makes right and territory is taken by force. A defeat in Ukraine means a more dangerous and less peaceful world. Ukraine gave up its nuclear deterrence, and look what happened to it. Will any other country surrender its nuclear arms now? On the contrary, Russia's actions in Ukraine encouraged a nuclear buildup. And though Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, it has nuclear plants that it uses for energy generation, and the Russians have showed no regard for safety, as they have taken over some of them and conducted assaults on others. Ukrainian nuclear risks are significant right now, and the US should be paying more attention to them, as should the world. The risk is another Chernobyl, and there's no guarantee that the fallout will be limited to Ukraine. The war in Ukraine also threatens the global food supply. Before the war, Ukraine accounted for about 9% of global wheat exports, and poor countries are among its biggest customers, places in Africa and the Middle East. Vladimir Putin knows that hunger leads to political unrest, and he also knows that some of the most vulnerable countries are also very politically precarious. He hopes to use the threat of instability as diplomatic leverage. If we want to be able to focus on the China threat, if we allow Ukraine to lose, we are creating a world where our attention will be divided and where it's much more difficult to do that. Emboldened authoritarians are also assertive authoritarians. They're emboldened to carry out cyber attacks. They're emboldened to try to suppress speech online beyond their borders. And these authoritarians want to set the terms that will govern the world. If they succeed, the presiding values will not be liberty or respect for human rights and rule of law. This year, I have been blown away by the courage of ordinary Ukrainians. They are outnumbered and they are outgunned, but they continue to fight against all odds because they know the stakes of defeat. And I hope that we do too. Thank you. I think I have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to take a sip of water because my voice is giving out a little.
You take
send them my way.
Take a sip of water, Jillian, and we've got some good questions from the audience here, and we've got 10 minutes left. So I think I know what your answer to this question may be based on your closing comments, but I'll go ahead and ask on behalf of the audience member who submitted this question. While it's absolutely horrible, obviously, what's going on in Ukraine, is it appropriate for the U.S. to send billions of taxpayer dollars when we have a tremendous homeless, drug, crime, and other problems in this country?
Yeah, I would say it's a bargain. Right now, we've got Ukrainians who are willing to fight this war for us. If we leave Russian aggression unchecked, it's going to expand. We're going to have to clean up the mess. If we spend now, it's a penny today. It will be much, much more expensive in the future. So I say arm them. It's a fraction of what we spent on several of the COVID bills. This is a bargain.
Another question, many people have said that if we still had President Trump in office, that Putin would have never acted so aggressively and invaded Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that matter?
Well, I think that's probably true. At the same time, so I do think the response would have been more forceful. At the same time, I have my frustrations with the Trump administration for also not doing enough to arm Ukraine before we got to this stage and to deter a Russian invasion. So I do think that Putin acted when he did because he sensed weakness. That said, any president has to understand that their time in office is limited. And I think that the Trump administration could have done future administrations a favor by being more aggressive with the arms. And I really hope the Biden administration learns that lesson, because we are in a parallel situation with Taiwan right now.
Yeah. Gosh, you've really already addressed so many questions because your remarks were so complete. Can Ukraine really hope to defeat Russia with any amount of donated money and arms, or is that just prolonging the suffering?
I think so. And the reason why I think this is, if you look at what they've done with very little military equipment and very little ammunition, it's remarkable. Institute for Study of War puts out maps of occupied territory. And in March, I remember looking at them, and it looks like a cancer growing on Ukraine. It went all the way down to Kiev. It was nearly encircling it. And you saw, even with not ideal weapons, with soldiers that did not have the equipment that they needed, major territorial gains, pushing them back really, really far. Look, the Russian soldiers who are fighting there right now, one thing to understand about the Russian military is it's conscription-based. It's a lot of very poor people. And the reason that it is because nobody wealthy wants to serve in the Russian military. They want to go into business. They want to enjoy the fruits of corruption. And so oligarchs will pay for their kids to skip out on military service. It is a military service that basically kind of resembles kidnapping and hazing. It's really brutal. So you've got a lot of soldiers there that aren't particularly fighting because they have allegiance to Russia. It's because they've been bullied into this situation. And it's, Hannah Arendt talks a lot about in Origins of Totalitarianism, how if you live under a totalitarian state, one of the ills that this does to a population is it deprives them of the capability of making any moral choice. And I think that's what you see right now with the brutality and the atrocities that Russians are carrying out. They're acting immorally, and that's because they are the product of an immoral country. Ukrainians, though, have a sense of something better. They are fighting for something. And you get that sense of morale the second you go there. I mean, everybody's fighting to do it. And so I think they've got the determination and the grit to fight. They just need the weapons.
Here's a very practical question. How are Ukrainians able to keep the electricity flowing?
That's a great question. It's something that I've asked too. They have somewhat considerable energy resources, although a lot of them are in eastern Ukraine and occupied territories. They have pretty sizable nuclear facilities. Again, you run into the problem of some of those being occupied, but the train system is actually really important right now, and it's under a ton of stress because not only is it taking people to safety, not only is it ferrying in diplomats, you've got heads of state, different political leaders going to Kiev to show solidarity. It is also, you've got almost the entire Black Sea cut off, so those trains are taking grain shipments for the world that used to travel by sea out. On their way back from taking that grain to the European border, they're taking diesel back in. But you see huge energy cost spikes. If you go to the gas stations, you'll see queues for gas because there's a shortage. It's going to be a problem, but it's going to be a problem for all of Europe.
This is a question that's been on the minds of a lot of people. Why do you think the U.S. has not assassinated Putin, or the U.S. or some other country?
Well, the first thing that springs to mind is that's pretty difficult. I guess I can't really answer that one without being part of the administration, but anytime you have an act like that, it's obviously really extreme. There's a ton of unintended consequences from it, and this is a country that's already had a lot of political instability and discontent, so I'm not sure why we haven't, but I would say that there would be some significant unintended consequences potentially from this. I also think that maybe what that question is getting at is if you took out Putin, would you take out the problem? And I'm not necessarily sure that's true. If you look at the Soviet Union when it collapsed, you've still got a lot of the legacy structures of it, a lot of the legacy mentality, and a lot of the people that took advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union are old communist hands. And so in any authoritarian or totalitarian country, you don't derive the legitimacy of the government from the consent of the governed. And one really good way to get your people behind you if they're not free is to gin up nationalism. So I'm not even sure that if you were to remove Putin from the equation, that whoever replaced him would be better.
Final question, and then I would say leave us with any closing thoughts. Have you ever had any fear for your own safety while you're there?
Yeah, yes. So I've stayed pretty far from the front line. That's something that it's a decision I made after talking to my editor, after talking to my husband, and also just looking at the needs of what I cover. On our news side, we have really brave reporters that are going out to the front line enduring the shelling. I want to understand the bigger picture so I can explain it to you. And that story at the beginning of the war was in Western Ukraine. Right now it's in Kiev. That said, all of Ukraine is under assault. So the last trip that I took, I was driving into Kiev, and that morning there were 4 missile strikes on the city. You just kind of don't know what you're getting into. I'm really fortunate to have the support of an institution like the Wall Street Journal. Before I went out, when an active war had begun, I went to hostile environment training. We learned how to handle ourselves in emergency situations. But it definitely is a thing where you go in knowing that you're undertaking a risk. And the reason that I'm undertaking that risk is because I think this is a story that needs to be told. And I think it has enormous stakes for the future, for the world order. And I also just, if you see Ukrainians behaving, which ordinary Ukrainians, behaving with that level of courage, courage inspires courage, so I can buck up and do it.
Thank you, Jillian Melchior.
Thanks.